lawn, something along those lines, somewhere where we're feeling like we can just get into rest and relaxation mode. And last piece is any questions that you have over the course of the session, would love for those to be sent through into the chat function. And we're going to get some of those answered over the course of our session here. So we're going to hang tight for maybe just a minute or two here to let a couple more folks join in, and then we'll go ahead and start kicking into our session. So just hang tight for a moment or two here.
I don't know.
Alrighty, folks. Well, I think we might go ahead and start diving in here a couple minutes after the hour, a couple hundred folks online here, and want to make sure that, yeah, we make the absolute most of our time together. So what we're going to do is just cover off on a couple of housekeeping items before diving in. So for those of you that have been on happy hours here before, you do know I've got the happy hour shirt on, and it is, of course, a Thursday, and the sun is out there nice and shining, getting warm, starting to feel like summer. So go ahead and pour yourself a little drink. I think I saw a comment and two in there about the wine is flowing, so love to hear that. Grab yourself a little snack, kick back, relax. We're going to have ourselves a really fun little evening here. Second piece is I really encourage everyone to sit somewhere else to where they work over the course of the week here. Out of being in working mode, working brain, and into just rest, relaxation. So if you're able to make your way onto a patio, a back deck, front lawn, something along those lines, go ahead and do so. And then third piece is just any questions that you have over the course of the session, go ahead and type those into the chat function, as that's where I'll be monitoring that and passing some of the questions along to Brian. And so just to make sure that the chat function is working for everyone, I would love to hear what vegetable or flower or herb is doing best in your garden right now. What's everybody got growing that's doing really, really well? Let's see if the chat function's working here. All right, the broccoli is doing well. Parsley, basil for Tina, the beans, the valerian. I just got some valerian seeds, but I'm super excited to get going. Roses and strawberries, zucchini, tarragon, radishes. The list goes on and on here. Amazing. Well, it sounds like everyone is having a whole lot of successes. I'd say that for myself, the cabbage are looking beautiful. We just took a picture and the cabbage leaf is probably like my hand, and then you take a second hand and were to put it all the way around, is the current size of it. And then my peppers, I've built them little hot houses, so they're really, really, really happy as well. And then on the downside, I've got a couple broccolis that are bolting, and I just a couple minutes ago, we were taking some pictures in the backyard and topped one of my cucumbers that was doing so well. So some good and some losses. Always a garden flop or fail along the way as well. Well, it looks like the chat function is working here. So just to do a couple of introductions, for those of you I have not met before, my name is Jordan. I'm the founder here at Mind and Soil, and we're a gardening business based out of Squamish, BC here. And we approach things a little bit differently in that we are entirely focused on connecting new and existing gardeners to the mental health benefits that come from gardening. So for those of you that have been gardening for many or multiple years, my guess is that a big part of why you come back to the garden, why you're so excited every spring and summer, is because of how restful it is, how calming, how peaceful it is, and how it makes you just feel very, very relaxed. And for those of you that are potentially on the newer side to gardening, I know that at the beginning it can feel a little bit daunting and a little bit overwhelming. I don't know what to be doing, where to be getting started. I'm starting to see some flowers on my fruits, but I don't know, on my vegetables, but I don't know if they are getting pollinated and turning into fruits. And so a huge part of our duty and our responsibility here at Mind and Soil is to do educational events like this, where we get a whole bunch of individuals together, try to answer a whole bunch of questions, do a whole bunch of education as well, to help ensure that those of you that are getting into gardening for potentially the very first time or on the earlier side are feeling more comfortable and more confident in the garden as you start to get your hands dirty. And for tonight's session and tonight's evening, I'm so excited that we're joined by a very incredibly knowledgeable and experienced individual. And it's really cool because this evening, on the last 5 or 6 happy hours that we've done, I've done all the presenting. But for tonight, I get to take a bit of a back seat and be a student as well here, because we're joined by Brian Campbell, who works at West Coast Seeds, and he wears a whole number of hats at West Coast Seeds, does lots of work with the actual seeds, purchasing them, making sure they're all super high quality. But he also is incredibly knowledgeable and experienced in the world of pollination. So he founded and created the Bee School, and he gives a number of talks all throughout North America at universities and colleges on pollination and pollinators. So it's going to be super exciting listening to him and a little bit more of his knowledge. And so with that said, Brian, I'd love to pass it over to you just to have you share a little bit more of your gardening journey and your experience learning about pollinators and pollination. And then when you're all set, just let me know to click to the next slide and I'll go ahead and do that. Perfect. And we're just going to pop you off mute here, Brian. There we go. Perfect.
Yeah, I was trying to improve the lighting, but I'm halfway there. The how I got started with pollination and pollinators was homeschooling my kids, and we were doing a lot of gardening, and they wanted to know more about insects. And so I know a lot about insects, but not at that time, not anything very deep in particular. And so I did some research, and I considered beetles, but beetles are a huge area. And I discovered that there are about 66 or so species of bee in the lower mainland. And I thought that is a manageable number to study and maybe keep one step ahead of my kids, who are all very smart. And so I started studying native bees, solitary mostly, and bumblebees, and I gradually got involved in honeybees, and then started teaching workshops, giving workshops, and teaching beekeeping, and gradually got more academic in my approach, and have had many of relationships with academia, and of course through my work at West Coast Seeds, I've had many chances to explore the relationship of plants and pollinators. One of my jobs there is to compose wildflower blends that have been very successful. The Bee Garden Blend, for example, and many other blends as well. So I've been very fortunate to be able to pursue something that I feel very passionate about. I tried to get my kids really excited about it, and I found at a certain point that we were chasing bees, and then eventually one day it was just me. They'd all moved on to something else. But yeah, that's how I got into bees and pollination, and I keep expanding my interests. I'm very interested in the relationship of wasps to plants, which is a very intimate relationship as well, and fascinating too. I think I like insects that sting. That's the main thing.
I love it. And it's interesting that you bring up wasps. We'll start diving in just a second here, but I'd love, because this is an area that I'm curious about as well, to hear your thoughts on wasps. I think there's a lot of love and adoration for the bees, But then there's the wasp, which I think in some avenues or circles is viewed a little bit more as the bad guy. And so is the wasp a bad guy, or is the wasp a little bit misunderstood?
Definitely misunderstood. Wasp diversity is really high. Um, Wasps, the job that wasps do is they clean up our gardens. So they're predators of pest species, things that really bother gardeners. So they eat aphids, for example. They feed them to their offspring. Um, Moth caterpillars. So all the things that really bother us, wasps take care of. But they're also very important pollinators as well. Uh, so we know about honeybees, but what we don't know is that there's about 30,000 species of bee in the world, and maybe 150,000 wasp species. So they really cover quite a diverse range. The uh, Just to digress very quickly, the world's smallest known wasp species is just slightly larger than a single-celled amoeba. I mean, it's really
Oh,
tiny,
wow.
and it lays its eggs inside of thrips' eggs. So it's a very useful plant for or a predator on thrips. I mean, no one likes thrips really. And of course, there are the giant uh, the Asian giant hornet that's been getting the news recently. So they go from microscopic to huge, and they cover almost every kind of uh, niche that you could imagine. Plus, they are also pollinators. So when we think about pollinators, often we know about honeybees, but what many people don't know is uh, pollinators co-evolved with the plants that they pollinate, and that didn't happen at the same time in the same way or the same place. And that's why there's such a diversity of pollinators, hummingbirds and butterflies and moths and bats and even mice are pollinators in some circumstances, as well as bees and wasps and beetles, and they all have this very intimate relationship with the plants that they co-evolved with. And so we need biodiversity. So we all know about honeybees, and honeybees kind of take up a lot of our imagination and a lot of media coverage. But we really need to pay more attention to biodiversity, because honeybees, they can't do it all. They are not they're not that superhero pollinator that we would like them to be. So we need biodiversity, pollinator diversity, if we want a healthy ecology to live in.
Love it. And yeah, I love what you mentioned there as well in terms of the wasps and them kind of being one of the keepers of the garden, where they play a role on the pollination side, but also many areas outside of that. And maybe, even to take a quick step back from the specific types of pollinators, Brian would love to hear your thoughts just on kind of why is pollination important, and where does pollination and pollinators fit into the overall gardening sphere?
Well, certainly they're very important to people. Pollinators have not been the main actors in human culture, but they have been like the set designers. So when we think about the things that define human culture, uh, the foods we eat, uh, uh, medicinal plants, dye plants, for example, often they're pollinated by insects and other pollinators. So they're not center stage, but they've made human culture possible by through pollination. Also, just in terms of human food, what we want to eat, pollinators pollinate over 75% of our food crops. So, things like, if we didn't have pollinators, um, an Italian meal would be pasta, so from wheat, which is wind pollinated, but it wouldn't have tomatoes, wouldn't have peppers or basil or any or oregano, for example. And so there's a lot of things that we don't really think of as a bee pollinated plant, but are really essential to the enjoyment of our lives. So we wouldn't starve to death if we didn't have basil, but I think our lives are better if we've got these herbs and these other plants that are bees are responsible and other pollinators are responsible for creating for us.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of one of those things where it's almost symbolic in some ways, in that like bees are very much attracted to the colors. And in a lot of ways, if we didn't have the bees and our pollinators, our dishes, our meals, our food would also be lacking a lot of color, right? We'd still have the wheat pasta, but we wouldn't have the nice pesto or the marinara sauce that'd be
Yeah,
going with it. So they
yeah.
certainly add a lot of color to the picture here. So I'd love to hear your thoughts here, Brian, just in terms of some of the vegetables that are requiring pollinators and what that relationship looks like.
Thanks, Jordan. The Certainly the relationship, the pollinator plant relationship is very complex and pretty awesome. Like the things that happen. So squash, love story. Uh, the I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but the watermelon. To produce a watermelon requires 70 bee visits to a flower for that plant, the watermelon plant, to commit to growing a watermelon. So each seed that gets fertilized sends a signal to the plant, feed me. And if that plant receives from the ovary enough of a chemical signal that enough seeds have been pollinated, it will grow a watermelon. And so it's about 70, a minimum of 70 bee visits from one flower to another. And it's, so it's quite a tenuous relationship, a very, hanging by a thread, whether we're going to get a watermelon or not. Luckily, in many situations, we do have enough bees to create that situation. The other thing is, when we think about pollination, we just imagine somehow a bee flies from one flower to another and pollination occurs, but it's far more interesting and dynamic than that. Uh, so when we think about, for example, tomatoes, again, I'm wondering if I'm jumping ahead here,
No,
but
you jump wherever you'd like, and I'll keep us somewhat on the path.
okay, thanks, thank you. Uh, Tomatoes are best buzz pollinated, and there aren't very many insects that can do this, but one of them are bumblebees. So bumblebees can actually change the frequency of their buzz to the equivalent of a C note. And what that does, so tomato plants will hold their pollen and will not release the pollen unless a pollinator, like a bumblebee, can hit that C note, and and then the pollen comes out, and the plant is fertilized. The flower is fertilized. So tomatoes are relatively self-fertile. So even if they don't get a pollinator like a bumblebee, they will produce a fruit, but the fruit will not be very, very good.
Hmm.
And uh, so really, bumblebees are used in tomato pollination, greenhouse production to pollinate the flowers, and they really help tremendously. And of course, there's many other plants that they visit, and they help to create fruit from. They visit rhododendron, for instance. They're not a buzz pollinator on rhododendron, but the rhododendron produces a toxic nectar that other bees cannot visit and will not cannot consume. But so this is a relationship, a different kind of relationship where the rhododendron is uh, has developed a relationship with the bumblebees where the bumblebee can drink that nectar and digest it, whereas other bees can't. So it makes the bumblebees more faithful to the rhododendron flower. And so the rhododendron receives this benefit, but so do the bumblebees.
Incredible. Uh, it's wild how hitting that certain note will allow the plant to kind of begin to open up and make the pollen available for the plant ultimately to be fertilized there. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when we were getting ready for this, you mentioned that you had almost like a sounding brush or something along those lines that can hit that tune that will allow one of the flowers to open up and for the pollen to be available. Is that right?
Right. I don't have it handy. I use a tuning fork to demonstrate what a C note sounds like. And if you're out in your garden and you have tomatoes, you're trying to grow tomatoes, or if you have other plants like blueberry, many plants in the Ericaceae are buzz pollinated. So follow a bumblebee around in your garden, and you could hear the change in the tune of the buzz. I advise people if they have a teenager to buy them an electric guitar and a giant amp, and they could pollinate the entire neighborhood with a C note.
No
Every,
kidding.
everyone's would. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a couple questions that have come through here. One was in terms of the watermelons here. And so I'm just going to pull it here. I believe it was from Margaret. Yeah, so Margaret was wondering, Brian, what you said about watermelons and the number of visits that it takes and requires. Is it the same for other melons like cantaloupes?
It really varies. Like so, in the cucurbits, like so cucumber and pumpkin and so on, the number of bee visits varies quite considerably. Most pumpkins require about 19 bee visits to produce a pumpkin. Many cucumbers, it's between 24 and 30 bee visits to produce a cucumber. The watermelon is probably the highest number in the cucurbits. So it really pays to have a garden that attracts bees. So if you have flowers and if you're trying to produce cucumbers or squashes, and you want to make sure that there's pollination is going to happen, uh, plant flowers that will invite bees into your garden, and they will naturally find your other crops and pollinate those as well.
Love it. And another question that came through from Anne here, which might be a little bit more technical. Anne was asking, Brian, one of my neighbors keeps bees. This year he has black bumblebees. Are they different than your typical bumblebees? For instance, are they different in terms of functions, preferences, etc.? What are the differences between the two?
I am not familiar with black bumblebees. Uh, Keeping black bumblebees. So did he purchase them, maybe, or there's certainly there are a very common bumblebee species is Bombus vossinescii, and it's mostly black, sometimes called the yellow-faced bumblebee. It has a yellow face, and a part of its thorax is yellow, and it has a yellow stripe on its abdomen near the stinger. Uh, is maybe that's the bumblebee she's talking about? It's naturally occurring.
Sure.
Bumblebees are extremely important to us, to uh, uh, a sustainable future. And unfortunately, they're quite endangered. Um,
Hmm.
One of the precursors to extinction is shrinking habitat. So, because of climate change, bumblebee habitat is actually shrinking, and they are not, the majority of them are not migrating north to have more ideal conditions. So they're staying in place and their habitat is shrinking, which really pushes them onto into a situation where they're becoming endangered. And they are so integrated into many of our native plants and our food crops as well. We certainly don't want to lose them.
Yeah.
So we need to think.
Totally. And I'm definitely going to
So
want
go
to hear
on.
more of your thoughts on that and just kind of the bee crises that we find ourselves in at the moment. Just one more question on this cucumber piece before, or sorry, this watermelon piece before we dive along to beginning to speak about bees. When we think about some of these vegetables needing 19 or 30 or 70 visits, why is it that they need so many visits to the plant? Is it that they don't have pollen on them, or is it something different? What's the rationale behind that? I,
So the reason why is because when if you cut open a watermelon, you'll see it has three sections to it, and each seed, when it's been fertilized, sends a signal to the plant to grow that fruit. But if not enough seeds has been fertilized, the signal isn't strong enough, and the plant will sacrifice the fruit. It'll simply get rid of it. So within this time frame, it's only about a day that the watermelon plant or other cucurbits have. So it's a fairly intense kind of relationship that the cucurbits have with their pollinators. But it's not one bee usually doing the job. I would say it's a pollination guild. So with watermelon, it might be 8 or 9 native bee species that are doing the job. And so they're, it sounds like, wow, so many bee visits. But if there's, 8 or 9 species of bee, that's actually, you know, uh, not so difficult. And it's just amazing that we get watermelon
yeah,
out of this
no
kind of
kidding.
relationship.
I had no idea that it took that many visits back to the plant for it to kind of hit that tipping point of, okay, it's time to be able to produce the fruit. Um, well, with that said, Brian, I'd love to kind of hear and learn a little bit around cross-pollinating versus self-pollinating. Kind of what's the difference between the two of them there?
There are plants that definitely need cross pollination. So apples, for example, many pears need cross pollination. Some cherries, definitely. Um, Many plants in the cucurbit, so cucumbers, squashes, need cross pollination. So the reason why is because the pollen that they produce themselves are too close to their own genetics, and so they just won't work. So I think of it like a zipper. You need two halves of the zipper to kind of work together. So you need one plant to receive the pollen and the other to be the pollen donator to end up with seeds. But many plants do have a backup plan. And so even if they don't get pollinated, they can still produce seeds. So modern raspberries, for example, that's something we were talking about earlier. don't need cross pollination. So they don't need to borrow pollen from a different cultivar of raspberry, but they still need a bee. So a residual characteristic of modern raspberries since like maybe the last 30 years or so of raspberry um, uh, plant breeding, they need a bee to visit. And it's the mechanism of a bee visiting and doing almost like a pseudo pollination is what makes the raspberry. Even though there isn't a cross pollination happening, it's still a we could think of it as a self-fertile plant, but it still needs a bee. Um, Blueberries are relatively self-fertile as well. They will produce fruit without cross-pollination, but they're one of those plants that do best with a buzz pollinator in the first 2 or 3 days when the flowers open. So a bumblebee visiting will make a really big blueberry fruit, but after 3 days, the buzz pollination mechanism breaks down, and then you could have a honeybee can pollinate, but the fruit won't be as big as what a bumblebee could have made. But even if there's no fruit visited or no bee visited, you'd still get a blueberry, but it would be very tiny.
Right, right, right. I've definitely got a few of those in the backyard, so some work for me to do. And kind of on this concept of cross-pollinating, there's a really good question that came through from Daniela here. So Daniela was wondering, Brian, does planting different kinds of squash close together cause an issue with the crop when they can be cross-pollinated? Kind of what happens in that instance?
We don't really have to worry about that unless you're trying to save seeds. So if you want to save seeds, then you need to control cross pollination. You don't want them to be cross. I used to be a garden judge in Richmond for I don't know, it was over 10 years, and I was visiting a community garden, and there's a guy who had squashes that, I mean, honestly, they look like vomit. They were so awful. Holy cow, they just looked like the most ugly squashes ever. And he thought they were due to cross pollination. And the thing is, yes, they were, but not that year. They were cross pollinated the year before. So the company, it was not West Coast Seeds, that he bought those seeds from did not control the cross pollination. So uh, you've got this named cultivar, a pumpkin, and a bee moves pollen from a different cultivar of pumpkin to your pumpkin, and the seeds. So the pumpkin looks normal, looks like it should look like, but the seeds are going to be, when you grow them out, they're not going to be true to form. And boy, those were the least appetizing pumpkins I have ever seen. But it wasn't because of that year, it was the year before. So,
Right.
uh, yeah.
Super, yeah, super fascinating. And I suppose just to, go down that path a little bit, if you were trying to really control pollination and prevent any cross pollination from happening, what would you be doing to, try to ensure that there isn't any, pollen moving from cultivator A to cultivator B?
So, again, that's really only an issue if you're trying to save seeds
Yeah.
and keep things really clear. But with cucumber and other cucurbits like pumpkin and squashes, you can actually just use a clothespin when the flower opens. Use a clothespin to keep it closed, and then you could hand pollinate and control the flow of pollen that way. Um,
That's really cool.
yeah,
I've
that's
never
probably
thought of, yeah, like intentionally keeping the flower closed and then coming back in to hand pollinate it at a specific point. And for anybody that's wondering what hand pollination is, we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes here. But that's a really interesting point there, Brian. So yeah, kind of cruising along here. We've already talked a little bit about bees, but what are some of the, especially for kind of the first time gardener, what are the things about bees that we should absolutely know?
Well, most bee species are ground nesting. So if you're concerned about bee conservation and pollinator diversity, we really need to focus on soil and think about soil and conserving soil. Certainly, many people, honeybees have taken over the word bee. So when people talk about bee or bees, they're mostly they're talking about honeybees. And I've come to the conclusion that when we talk about honeybees, we're not even talking about honeybees. We're talking about beekeeping and commercial beekeeping. So we need to get away from talking about honeybees and talking about pollinator diversity and conserving that as much as we can that diversity. So the vast majority of bee species are ground nesting. So we need to think more about uh, conserving soil and being careful about how we treat our garden spaces, and so that we don't kill other bee species.
That's a
Uh,
really interesting point because I think normally when we think about inviting bees, we think about flowers and having lots and lots of flowers for them. But I think you kind of raised the point there that they have a home as well, and it sounds like that is something that we find in the ground and within the soil. So from like a soil maintenance perspective, what should we be doing to help create a kind of an inviting environment for these bees to have good homes within the garden?
well, I always think about having a lawn chair and a glass of iced tea. So you're out in the garden and you see a hole in the soil with some excavation that has happened. Pull up your lawn chair and a glass of iced tea and see what is coming and going. And if it's a bee-like creature, so it might look like a fly or a bee, or it might look like a wasp, um, in and out of that hole in the soil, mark it in some way. And the reason why is because when that bee is done, so they make almost like uh, it might look like a grapefruit or grape bunch structure. So there's a central entrance, and then there's these side cells that happen, and each cell would be an individual bedroom for a bee. So they gather pollen, uh, store the pollen, lay an egg, close the bedroom door, and when they're done, they hide the nest that they have created. So they've actually excavated this, and some of them could go quite deep, but once they're done, you can't find it again. So mark it in some way, uh, a wooden chopstick or a rock or something, and don't turn the soil, because if you do that, you'll kill those bees. So the adult might only be active flying as an adult for 2 or 3 weeks out of the year, and the egg that they lay will take an entire year to develop before it emerges as an adult. So we just want to be careful that if we have a garden that has ground nesting bees, that we find some way of conserving them and respecting the soil. Often, when we look at the city, we see that there's been this huge um, disruption in soil. We've really churned up the soil of the city, and it's really, I think, had a huge impact on the kind of bees that we have available to us.
Mhm.
So look at that. But when we think about bees, we think, oh, bees sting, but really most of these native bee species are not stingers at all. They have the capacity to sting, but often the venom that they contain in their sting is quite mild in comparison to, say, a honeybee or a yellow jacket. So it's very likely that you won't react at all. And many of them are very tiny as well, so they don't contain a lot of venom. So we
Yeah.
shouldn't really worry about being stung or being afraid of them at all.
Yeah. And, in one of our previous happy hours, Mark was on it and we were talking about insects, and there's a bit of this, stigma towards insects that they're bad and that they're pests. But the thing about it is that, like, in a lot of ways, we're almost the pests that, they were there doing their thing well before we put our house on this land and started changing and manipulating their home and their environment. And there's this bit of a shift that needs to happen in our mindset to how do we work alongside them. And so it's really like, it's great to hear from the bee perspective, that, yes, they've got, venom, or stingers, but like they're not out to get us. They're trying to live their life and
Yeah,
survive and stay alive.
yeah,
And we've interjected ourselves in their path. So it's just one of those shifts in terms of how we view it and the kind of the role that they are playing. And oh, go
yeah, yeah. So, oh, okay. Uh, Unfortunately, it just seems like everything is in decline. I was just watching just for a few minutes this evening, the evening news, how it seems that grizzly bears on the coast are starving to death,
ahead.
and they're swimming to Gulf Islands in search of food. And so this issue of the decline of bees and pollinators and diversity, it's really far-reaching, and the conditions that cause problems for bees um, are also conditions that cause issues, problems for grizzly bears, food and habitat and places to raise a family. Uh, it's you know it's really not a happy situation. But we, as gardeners and as people living in the city, we can do something to support bees. At least we maybe we don't want to invite a grizzly bear into our backyard, but we can definitely support bumblebees and other bee species, and have a really wonderful, welcoming, beautiful environment full of life. Why
Yeah,
not?
that's one thing that I was, really curious to hear your thoughts on is, when we think about any of us that have a garden, what are the things that we can be doing to, like, one, help invite bees in, two, provide kind of like an environment for them to call home, to ultimately help the kind of the bee problem, the bee crisis that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, so bees do need, and other pollinators need food, but they need three things in total. They need access to food, but they also need construction material to make a nest, and they also need a place to raise a family. And that's why I bring up this issue of ground nesting bees. That's a habitat for ground nesting bees. They need soil. And so we need to find some way of recognizing that and acknowledging it, and incorporating it into how we grow our food, and how we manage our gardens. Uh, and of course, forage is primarily flowers. Um, but the habitat aspect, or the construction material habitat, is often it's a little bit more complex. So there are snag nests, for example. So these are kinds of bees that want to nest vertically, not horizontally, and they will nest in pithy stemmed plants. So roses, blackberry, brambles of all kinds, and native berries, um, herbaceous perennials such as fennel or uh, sorry, I'm spacing out a little bit. But when we go out in the garden, we if we're growing roses and we harvest a bouquet of roses, because why else would you grow roses? You got to bring them into the house. Come on. And when we do that, we actually provide habitat for those bees. And if we're not aware of it, that we could, at the end of the year, we're cleaning up our garden, we could actually be throwing away into the compost native bee species that have moved into those rose stems. Are they causing harm? No, they're not. They're very tiny bees, and the nest aspect might only go to 1 or 2 inches deep within the stem, so they're not really causing a problem. And the next year, the rose will grow back just fine. So what I've done is I will collect those stems that have you could tell the end of the stem where I've collected my bouquet from, or my the rose the roses for inside my house. They'll have a little plug, and so I'll just collect the stems from those particular plugged material, and I'll put them out in the garden in a plant, a plastic plant pot with gravel, and I'll keep them upright because they're upright, vertical nesters. And I'll just leave it in the garden, and I'll put a little sign on them because my neighbors freak out about bees. So I'll put a little sign on them saying, on the pot saying, Zen garden. So people are like, why are you keeping those rose stems? It's a Zen garden feature. And just kind of get, direct people away from this idea of bees. And what will happen the next summer? They will emerge and they will pollinate my flower garden, and they'll produce help my garden be a healthier and more beautiful feature. Um,
Yeah, I
so there's
love
a
it.
lot of ways that, yeah, thanks. So when we think about supporting bees, we think about planting flowers, but we need to think also about habit. The where are they going to nest, and what material do they need? At UBC Botanical Garden, there is a species of bee in the Megachilidea, so related to the blue orchard bee, or commonly called mason bee. It uh, uses flower petals. So it's a kind of leafcutter bee, and instead of cutting a round circle out of a leaf, it cuts a round circle out of a flower petal.
Hmm.
So it's very important. It's very important to plant native native plants, native flowering plants, and this is one of the reasons why. Because I actually at this moment I can't remember what plant it likes, but it is a native plant, and like a leaf cutter, it's a ground nester. It cuts a perfectly round circle out of a flower petal and will take it into its underground nest, and it will make a cell out of these uh, flower petals, then gather pollen and lay an egg, and collect another petal circle to close the nest off. So they look actually quite a bit like when I first discovered these. To me, it looked like uh, some bizarre smoker, like someone who'd been smoking cigars or something, had lined them up. Like what a bizarre thing to do with your um, cigar butts.
No kidding.
Actually, they're ground nesting bees, leaf cutter bees that collected uh, flower material. It's really incredible, and had really beautiful stuff as well. So we need to not just think about flowers as food and what they need, but also where do they need to nest, and what kind of material do they need to help build that nest.
Absolutely, and I think everything that you mentioned in terms of the ground nesting and the role that soil plays in the bees as well, and just how important it is to not be turning over that soil. It really, just kind of drills it home the importance of it, and just how much life is beneath the surface there, both in the soil and for the plants, but also for the surrounding environment that comes out at different times. So Brian, we're going to give you a quick break for a couple minutes here before coming back for a little bit of question and answer, because I'm going to shed a little bit of light on hand pollinating. And so just as I
Yeah.
chat through hand pollinating here, folks, if you have any questions that you'd like for us to try and get to for kind of 5 or 10 minutes towards the end, then go ahead and pop some of those into the chat function, and we'll answer a few of those before we wrap up for the evening. But one thing that we wanted to touch on as well is, what do we do if we don't have tons of pollinators around in our environment? And the kind of question there would be like, what kind of environment would this be? Well, perhaps if you're living in a townhouse, or there was a point in time where I was living on like the 16th floor in Vancouver with a small little patio garden, and certainly not too much other life around up at that area. And so there wouldn't have been as many pollinators up there. And we know now that our plants need to be pollinated. So what do we do in that instance? And that's where this concept of hand pollination comes in. And this is where we are essentially simulating what a pollinator would be doing. And so to really kind of like bring it to ground zero and to the very beginning here, what is pollination and why does pollination matter? Well, pollination, that is the process, right, of the pollen going from the male flower over to the female fruit, which marked the beginning of the development of the fruit there. Very much, when we think about it from a hand pollinating perspective, this kind of becomes the process of artificial insemination for plants here, where we are moving the pollen from the male plant over to the female fruit there. So the next question that we'd want to understand is, where is that pollen living? And what's much different about plants is that it's broken into two categories, where we either have our perfect flowers and our imperfect flowers, or our complete flowers and incomplete flowers. And what this means within the plant space is that our perfect flowers are ones that have both the male and the female reproductive elements located within one flower, while the imperfect flowers are ones that would have a distinct male flower with the male reproductive elements and the pollen, and then a distinct female flower with the female reproductive elements and the fruit. And we need to pay attention to that when it comes to how we go about hand pollinating. So what we're going to do is bring this to life with a couple of actual examples here. So starting with our perfect flowers, or our complete flowers, a couple of examples of these are our tomatoes, our peppers, eggplants, peas, lilies, roses. And with these perfect flowers, again, when we look at this flower right here on the right, both the male pollen and the female fruit is located within that flower. And that's where a little bit of rustling it around, buzzing it, wind, or our hand can ultimately have the pollination occurring. And so in an instance like this, what you would be able to do is go up to that flower, and that in this instance is a tomato, and you can basically tickle it, push it around, bump it a little bit. And if it is happening on the right day where the pollen is available, that will make its way over to the female fruit, and ultimately result in pollination. So if you are looking for more tomatoes, more peppers this coming season, as you're going through your garden and going on a little walk, seeing how everything's doing, when you see those flowers, just go ahead and give them a little tickle or bump them around a little bit. And it's not going to do anything to hurt you. And best case scenario, one or two of those that may not have gotten pollinated, especially if you're in an environment where you don't have as many pollinators, are now going to get pollinated and result in more fruit available for you. I know that for myself, I have my peppers in little hot houses, which is like a greenhouse that goes over top of the garden bed to keep it nice and warm for them. But because of that, it also is creating a barricade, which keeps some of the pollinators out. And that's where I have to be a little bit more intentional of making sure that those ones are getting hand pollinated, as well as opening it up every now and then for some pollinators still to be getting in there. So that touches off on the perfect flowers and what we would be doing in that instance. But what do we do when it is an imperfect flower? And a couple of examples of this are our zucchinis, our cucumbers, our squash, corns, walnuts. And in this instant, there is a distinct male flower and a distinct female flower. And so what we're needing to do now is actually move the pollen from the male flower over to the female flower. And a couple of ways that we could go about doing this is using something like a Q-tip or a paintbrush. Those are both really, really great tools or devices to get some pollen on it and move it over to the female fruit. So let's go ahead and let's dive in a little bit further to this zucchini plant that we're looking at here. And when we look at it, what we're going to notice here is that beneath this one flower is something that looks a heck of a lot like a teeny tiny zucchini. And that is the fruit. That is the baby, which means that this is a female flower. And then what we have up beside it is another flower. And when we look at the base of it, there isn't that distinct zucchini fruit that's sitting there, which would make this the male flower. And this is something that it'll take a little bit of getting used to if you're doing it for the first time, but it's a really, really, really amazing way to learn your plants in a kind of a greater and more detailed manner than beforehand. So even if you have lots of pollinators, I really encourage you to spend a season doing this, because you're going to spend some time like really seeing like not just a cucumber or a zucchini or squash while it's developing, but what does it look like when it is pre-pollinated and has not started to develop. It's really fascinating to follow that journey all the way along. So now that we know which one is our male flower and which one is our female flower, we need to move the pollen from the male to the female. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab, again, either a Q-tip or a paintbrush, and we're going to go down to that male flower. And in this instance, I was opening it up there, and I'm getting some pollen onto the end of that Q-tip here, where when we zoom in on it, we can see now on that Q-tip, I've got little beads of pollen that are on there. And we've now like successfully extracted it out of the male flower. And so what's now time to do is get this onto the female flower. And so you take that Q-tip, and then you're going to go ahead and find the female flower, and you're going to rub it onto the pistil of the female flower, which is located right in the middle, which you can just barely see there in that image, in that video that was playing there. And so that is what is then successfully moving the male pollen over to the female flower where the fruit is, resulting in it ultimately getting pollinated and then beginning to develop and grow into a zucchini or a squash or a cucumber. So once again, this is something that I would totally encourage actually everyone to do. For those of you that have, living in an environment where there are more pollinators, it's a great way to learn about your plants at a much earlier stage than just seeing this kind of final fruit and not being entirely sure how it got to that point. And for those of you that are in areas that don't have quite as many pollinators, well, this is a really great way to ultimately result in having a heck of a lot more fruit on your plants. So folks, that is everything that we wanted to cover off on this evening. Brian, thank you so much for joining us here. It's so cool. Like I could just ask you questions over and over and over just because there's so much knowledge and experience that you bring to the table, and hearing things like the C note and the bees living within the ground. It's so neat, so fascinating. So one, thank you so much for that. And two, I'd love to open it up for any questions that anybody might have in the chat function here. I've got a really great question here, Brian, from Sherry. And this is when we start thinking about hand pollination, but then also the watermelon that requires 70 visits or so. If you are growing watermelons, will that hand pollination method work? And if so, kind of how many times would you need to be going back to that flower with hand pollinating it for it to hopefully develop into a watermelon?
Technically, a watermelon requires 1,001 grains of pollen, evenly distributed across its stamens. How do you calculate that by hand? I'm not quite sure, but certainly you want to collect pollen from a number of different plants and do it several times. And, the proof will be the watermelon. And if you haven't succeeded this time, then you've got next year to give it another try. We can't expect success immediately. Experiment and give it a shot. Uh, I'm sorry, I can't answer definitively. I mean, come on, 1,001 pollen grains, that's pretty definitive. But, who's going to count them under a microscope? But your technique using a paintbrush or a Q-tip, and I would collect pollen from several different plants and do that. But if you're at a high elevation, like in a condo or apartment building, or in an area that has been very depleted for pollinators, then hand pollination is a viable option. I was reading how if we didn't have pollination for, say, apples, for example, a single apple would cost $10.
Hmm.
So hand pollination is quite expensive.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is, if we are seeing that we are in a situation where we're not having a lot of pollinators, plant more flowers, plant more diversity, and try to attract those pollinators. Of course, if you're on the 16th floor, that's very difficult. And then hand pollination is really the way to go, I think.
For sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of flowers, there, I had a great question that came through from Candace. Brian, do you have any suggestions for early season flowers to attract pollinators for early blooming plants?
There are so many options with plants. So when we think about trying to conserve pollinator diversity, we need to think about botanical diversity as well. And certainly a very early and very useful plant for pollinators would be camas. It's a native plant. I was looking very briefly at some of the questions, and there's it seems like some questions about honeybees. And honeybees are very attracted to plants that produce very high sugar content in their nectar, whereas native bees are much more interested in plants that produce high quality pollen. So we have to think about, well, what do we want from our plants? Do we want plants that are going to attract honeybees, or do we want plants that are going to attract native bees and other pollinators? So camas is definitely something that is a very useful plant, as well as sorry, I'm such a
No,
I usually fall asleep around this time. I sit down on the couch to watch Jeopardy, and I don't make it to the end. Anyway, so my brain is a little bit.
Either we've kept you interested, or you've got yourself a little happy hour drink there that I've seen you pull onto a couple times.
Wow.
We just got to get a happy hour shirt for the next one, and we'll be all set.
It's coffee, so I don't fall asleep. If you see me nodding off, it's not a success.
No, you're good. I think we only have one or two more questions here. One question, just kind of to wrap up on the flowers side, from Michelle. was, do you have any recommendations for edible flowers to go into the garden?
Well, sure. Like the West Coast Seeds website has a listing of many edible flowers, and there are many edible flowers that are really excellent for bees as well, like such as calendula and marigolds and viola, uh, just to to name a few. Almost all the flowers in the Rosaceae, so roses, but also related plants. So like apples are in the Rosaceae. Those flowers are edible too, but also all the plants in all the flowers in the Brassica family. So the entire, as far as I know, in the Brassica group, uh, every part of the plant is edible: the root, the stem, the leaves, the flowers, the seeds. And so Brassica, that would be broccoli, kohlrabi, cauliflower, mustards. There's so many, cabbage. And so you could eat the entire plant if you wanted to, as well as the flowers. Viola flowers are very edible as well. So the website, the West Coast Seeds website, lists many of them, and of course you can certainly grow any of them and enjoy an entirely new flavor and so on,
Yeah.
and support bees.
There we go. Yeah, I saw that Jason did share a link to a couple of resources on the flowers front in the chat there. So if anybody is looking for different flower options to be getting into your gardens, definitely go ahead and take a look at those lists that Jason shared through there. Well, I think maybe we'll do one, maybe two more questions here. One came through from JNC. Brian, do you have any suggestions for inviting pollinators and creating a habitat for them in a very shady area and a very windy area?
Wind is not very friendly to many bee pollinators. Shady, though, is okay. Many bumblebees are actually very adapted to shady areas. So I would suggest Kinnickinnick. Uh, West Coast Seeds does not sell Kinnickinnick seeds. They're probably best purchased as a plant. But also, we can do Chinese. Right. Yeah, I'm spacing out. So there are a number of shade-loving plants that West Coast Seeds carries. Foxglove, for example, is a shade-loving plant.
Love it.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
there are options.
for sure. And yeah, so let's wrap up here with one last question coming through from Daniela. And we've talked definitely about flowers and bees, but is there anything in particular that we should be doing to attract the other pollinators like beetles, hummingbirds, any of the other insects that lend a hand in pollinating? How do we invite them in?
I think one of the reasons why bees are so key is because if you plant a bee-friendly garden, you're going to attract all these other pollinators. So if we focus on bees, we'll get much success. So I've noticed that uh, the plants that hummingbirds really like, snapdragons, for example, are also bumblebee pollinated plants. So hummingbirds will visit them and bumblebees will visit them. So nectar is not a uniform substance. So something like snapdragon, the top layer is very watery and the bottom layer is very thick. This is one of the really cool things about the relationship between pollinators and plants is plants produce nectar uh, almost custom designed for their pollinators. For for example, bat pollinated plants produce a nectar that is really thick and very almost like a gelatin that is ideally suited for what bats need, to the extent that other pollinators cannot access that nectar. It's too thick for uh, butterflies or bees or other pollinators. Ideally suited for bat pollination. So something like snapdragons, it's a layered substance where at the top it's very watery, and at the bottom of the flower, the nectar will be very more gelatin-like. So that's where a bumblebee can access maybe the watery nectar, and a hummingbird could come in and drink the thicker nectar that the bumblebee can't access because of its how dense it is or how deep it is within the flowering. So when we focus on bees, we actually support all these other kinds of it here in the lower mainland. Anyway, we don't have bat pollinators in the lower mainland, but we certainly have butterflies and hummingbirds. And so if we focus on bees, we could achieve these other goals. And we don't have to have a single focus like on hummingbirds or anything like that. We could be more general in our planting.
Love it. Yeah. I think what I'm taking from that, and as one of the big takeaways for this session this evening, would be to plant a lot of different diversity. So a number of different types of flowers, and two, take care and build the soil, as that ultimately is a bit of a home for a lot of our pollinators as well.
Yeah, I would hope that would be a takeaway, that for people to think about things. I know you're a soil guy, and we need to think about soil in a different way, and in a more holistic kind of way. And I think often gardeners think about soil as simply as substrate for plants, but it's much more dynamic. And certainly, if we can be more inclusive about what soil is and more holistic about our approach, we're going to have better plants as a result. So it's not about just focusing on plants. It's about turning that soil into something that is so much more life-giving than how we currently think of it.
I love it. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time here this evening. Can't tell you how much I appreciate all of the input, thoughts, experiences, and stories with your kids over the years. So yeah, thank you so much for everything over the course of the evening here. And we'll let you get to your Jeopardy now. So folks, that is everything for this evening. Thank you all so much for coming and for all the amazing questions that have come through. One piece that I wanted to share just before we sign off here is, do expect to see over the next little bit, not a happy hour, but an on-demand course that you're going to be able to go through for succession planting. So I was out there filming a whole bunch of that content, building it all out this weekend, and you're going to be invited to that course very shortly here. So folks, that's everything for this evening. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your night, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.